All right, good morning again. And I appreciate you sitting down promptly because I have a lot of material and I'm trying to not go over time very hard. Okay, so we did class 1. Class 2 is on the persistent widow and how we learn to pray through adversity. Now, this widow is a little different than the first one in that she's sort of fictional. She wasn't a real person, okay? She's a symbolic character in one of Jesus' parables. But we'll find out that she actually personifies the situation, the desire, and faithfulness that believers have experienced throughout the ages. So, our agenda for today. We're talking about the power of persistent prayer. For those of you who like alliteration, there you go. The widow's adversary, the widow's adversary, and then God's vengeance, okay? Now, that might sound a little bit sort of ethereal for now, but it'll get more concrete in a second. And our big question we're asking ourselves today is prayer powerful? Okay? Now, you probably have seen the red book called Making Prayer Powerful. And the reason you need a book like that is because it's hard to know how to pray and to know what prayer actually does. And we're going to be looking at some people today. We're wondering if prayer was working because they kept praying and they didn't get a lot of answers, okay, or it didn't seem like they did. So in our first class, we talked about like the very literal upfront tragedy of being a widow, which is that you have loss and suffering and death in your family, and that's really hard. But in this class, we're going to talk about, this class and the next one, we're going to talk about how vulnerable they were to the deprivations of other people, the oppression that they experienced at the hands of those around them, who took advantage of their difficult situations. So we're going to see how they were victimized by their adversaries and how difficult to live within first century Jerusalem culture. And it was also hard for them to worship effectively. Interesting and kind of surprising about this story is that we don't situation of Nain. Okay? He comes in and he looks at them and he says, look at these widows. They're in a very difficult situation and they're being faithful. And he admires them and he holds them up as an example of how to cope when life is very, very difficult, when there's corruption and there's unfairness and injustice in the ecclesia and in the society around them. And he gives 2 coping mechanisms for how you can deal with these difficult circumstances. And we're looking at the first coping mechanism in this class. It's prayer. And the second one we're going to look at in the second class. So I'll leave it to that. What we're asking is, will God save us? Does God give us a way to move forward despite the oppression and the difficult circumstances we might be experiencing? So, start off in Luke chapter 18. Okay? Because you see, there was in a city, Jesus says, this is a parable he's giving. He says, there was in a city a judge. This judge did not fear God, and he did not regard man. And there was a widow in that city saying, avenge me of my adversary. And he would not for a while. But afterward he said within himself, though I fear not God, nor regard man, yet because this widow troubleth me, her continual coming, she wearies me. Okay? So before we get too far, take a look at the surrounding verses here and tell me, what is this parable about? What's the point of this parable? Why does Jesus tell it? Thank you. That's the point. It's verse 1, okay? Verse 1 tells us, let me get there. I need to really focus on what I'm doing. Verse 1 says, Jesus spake a parable to them to this end, which is a fancy way of saying, to this purpose, that men ought to always pray and not to faint. Okay? Or the ESV says, so that they do not lose heart. Because we have a tendency to get down, to get dejected, to lose heart, to grow weary. But Jesus says, don't do that when you're tempted to do that. Instead, he says, pray. But then the parable he tells to illustrate this principle is kind of strange, right? We have a widow. We've already talked about how vulnerable they were. and someone who's persecuting her, someone is her adversary, her enemy, making her life miserable. And so she's trying to use the justice system to find a solution. She's going to court. She's going to the judge and saying, "Judge, look at what's happening to me. This adversary is persecuting me. Help me." And the judge says, "You know what? No, I don't really feel like it. I'm not interested in helping you." Now that's kind of weird. Why wouldn't he want to help her? Well, we're told he was unjust later on. We're told he did not fear God, and he did not regard man. In other words, he doesn't care about fairness, he doesn't care about God, and he doesn't care about people, which is the kind of judge you really don't want to have. You agree? Right? So he's lazy, he's uninterested in helping. So what does the widow do? Does she say, "Well, this system is terrible, there's no justice in this place, I'm going to go back to my misery"? No, she continually comes to him every day, right? He gets out of his house and he hears a banging out of his bed and he hears a banging on the door, and there's the widow saying, "Avenge me of my adversary." And he's like, "Go away." And he goes, eats his cereal. Walking to work, and he's trying to walk through the back alley so the widow can't find him, but the widow's chasing him down and says, "Avenge me of my adversary." And he finally gets to the courthouse and locks the door, right? And then he's going out to get his coffee on his coffee break, and the widow says, "Avenge me of my adversary," all the time, all day, continually. And eventually he says, "I don't care about God, I don't care about justice, but I'm going to go throw this adversary in jail because I cannot stand this woman's continual pestering." Okay? That's the story Jesus told. And it's kind of comical, right? It's a little bit weird. Point of this. It's about prayer, right? This parable is about prayer, and the widow is the person who's praying, right? She's asking for something. Is this trying to tell us that God doesn't care about people, or God doesn't care about justice? And all he cares about is he just doesn't want to be pestered? Is that what Jesus is trying to tell us about God? Good answer. You should probably kick me out if I said that was the case. The good news is that Jesus tells us what he's trying to say, okay? So he says, that's the story, fun little story. But listen to this, he says. Listen to what the unjust judge said. He said, "I'll help you because you're pestering me." He says, but here's what God does. He says, "God give justice to his elect who cry to him day and night. Will he delay long over them? I tell you, he will give justice to them speedily." So Jesus is actually making a contrast here between the unjust judge who doesn't care about you and will only save you because he doesn't want to be bothered, and God who will give justice to his elect, who does care, who already cares about your situation. When you ask him for it, he's doubly wanting to help you out, okay? He will give justice speedily. But why give this illustration of this unjust judge? Well, the answer is that sometimes it can feel to us as though God is an unjust judge. It can feel to us that God doesn't really care about my problems. It can feel like he's not paying attention to my prayers. Right? I really want this thing. I really want this problem to go away in my life. I'm praying for it every day. And he doesn't answer. He doesn't change it. I get up, the situation's still there, the adversary is still on me, or that sorrow I have in my life, or that crippling problem I have that just keeps stopping me from living my life the way I want to, or the way God wants me to. And God doesn't do anything about it, or so it seems. And so our temptation then is to say, so God probably doesn't care about me. Maybe he just doesn't care about justice. Maybe he doesn't care about me. Maybe he doesn't care about people in general. Maybe he's just a God who's distant and far off and likes to just sort of mess around with the lives of people who try to serve him. And Jesus says, yeah, it's going to feel like that sometimes. But the lesson of this persistent widow is her persistence. She's always praying. She's always asking for help. She's pounding on the door of heaven. God, please help me. And if someone who doesn't care about that person would do it just to stop with the bother, how much more, Jesus says, would a God who is already on your side? Okay, so that's the general principle. What Jesus is trying to do is he's identifying an experience that believers all experience. This is experience of unanswered prayer, of having a problem in your life and going away. He's saying you're going to experience this question And the question is, will God answer prayers for justice? Okay. Initial answer is yes, he will. You just have to wait for him to do it at the right time. Okay? Now, hold all those thoughts for a second, and we're going to talk about a bigger picture of this parable. Because it's not just your individual life and your individual problems and your individual prayers. It's talking about something on a bigger scale, a bigger symbolic scale that comes from the Old Testament. Okay? In the Bible, if you were to look for what a widow represented in the big scheme of things, you would find that Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, is described as a widow. Okay? And you have to go to find that. You have to go to the saddest book of the Bible, to Lamentations. Okay? Lamentations is the book of the Bible that's Jeremiah, after Babylon comes and destroys Jerusalem and takes everyone captive. It describes like the terrible situation in the city where people are starving, they're abandoning their own children, or worse. They're doing all sorts of terrible things. Everyone is just sobbing and crying and desperate. And so Jeremiah describes Jerusalem like this. He says, "How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow has she become. She who used to be great among the nations, she who was a princess among the provinces, has become a slave." So he says, desolate, destroyed Jerusalem is like a widow. Okay? And then if you have the courage to read through the rest of Lamentations, it's just describing over and over again how bad it was in Jerusalem, how desolate it was to be this city, like a widow who has her husband is dead. Now the interesting thing is, if you turn over to the last chapter, the last few verses, you find that the question of the parable we just read is asked. Lamentations 5, verse 20 to 22, I believe this is from the ESV. Jeremiah asks, "Why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so many days? Restore us to yourself, O Yahweh, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us, and unless you remain exceedingly angry with us." So Jeremiah here is expressing the feeling that the people of Jerusalem had. They said, "Look, God, you let your city get destroyed. You let people come in and kill my husband and my family, and my kids have starved, and I'm starved within an instant of my life, and I'm full of disease from malnutrition and from viruses that have gone around through this situation under the siege." He says, "I'm in a terrible situation. It seems a lot like God has forsaken us." He says, "You don't care about us anymore. You're not interested in justice." And so the book ends with a question. In the King James it says, "But thou hast utterly rejected us." And that's not apparently the greatest translation. It's more of a question. Have you rejected us? Is this how you want the story to end, God? You want it to end with us just desolate and destroyed? And so that's the question that Jesus identifies. Because remember, he's speaking to the people of Israel, people of Judah. And are they free from oppression at this time? No. They are suffering under the occupying force of the Roman army. Right? And they're time when Jerusalem was destroyed. And so they're still wanting the kingdom to come. They're wanting to have independence again. They want to have their own nation. They want freedom. And so they still feel kind of like God isn't really paying attention to them and to their needs. But Jesus said something kind of interesting back in that parable, which was that the widow, she prayed continually. And so Jesus said, in answer, he says, God will avenge his people who do what? Who cry unto him when? Day and night. Shall not God avenge his elect, which cry to him day and night? And if you look at that, there's actually a lot of verses you can find in the Bible that talk about praying to God night and day. Okay, and the first one is the most significant, I think. It's 1 Kings 8, verses 29 to 59. This is the prayer of Solomon. The temple was just built at Jerusalem. Solomon offers this long, long prayer. Okay? And he starts it off and he asks for God's eyes to be open day and night to the prayers of his people. And then he goes through that prayer and he says, he sets up a ton of different scenarios that might happen to the children of Israel. He says, look, if the people have a sickness and there's sickness going throughout the land, and they come to this house and they pray to you, please hear in heaven your dwelling place, and when you hear, heal them. What if there's a famine, he says. If a famine comes into the land, please notice what's happening. They pray to you in this temple. Please forgive them. And he says, what if a nation comes against the city and besieges it, and they ask for help? They come to you in this temple and they say, God, please save us. Then hear from heaven your dwelling place, and when you hear, save them. Maintain their cause. Heal them. Give them life. Give them food. He says, even if they get taken captive, they get taken to a faraway land, if they from that place look towards Jerusalem and they say, please restore us, then he says, hear in heaven thy dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive, and when you hear, restore them, and bring them again to their land. Okay? And he opens that prayer, and he closes it with this phrase, that your eyes and your ears, God, would be attentive, would pay attention day and night to the prayers of your people. And that happened. Okay? Nehemiah 1 verse 6, Nehemiah is in captivity in the kingdom of Persia. He's the cupbearer to the king. He finds out about how desolate Jerusalem is back home, and he starts to cry. He's really sad. And so what does he do? He prays day and night for the redemption of his city. He actually tells God, listen to the prayers of your people who cry day and night to you. All right? Praying for redemption. And Isaiah 62 is one of my favorite chapters, and it says, God says, I have set watchmen upon the walls of Zion, and what I want them to do is to never hold their peace, which is a way to say, which means to never stop talking. And what are they saying? They're praying for God to restore Jerusalem. He says, I've set people there who are supposed to pray for that day and night, all the time. They will always pray for the redemption of Jerusalem. And we still do that, right? We pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Because God says, I put people there to pray night and day for the restoration of my kingdom. He wants us to do that because he will listen. And it may take longer than we want it to. It may not be when we demand. But God says it will happen. Okay, so when Jesus speaks this parable to the people about the widow in a city, right, who is praying for a redemption that doesn't seem like it's coming, he's getting them to think about all these principles from the Old Testament, about how Jerusalem was like a widow who needed redemption, and they were looking for redemption, but they weren't experiencing it. Okay? And this prayer that had been happening through the generations, through all the faithful people, night and day. All right. So back to Luke 18. I have a question for you. There's a third character. We talked about the judge. We talked about the widow. Who is the adversary? Doesn't really tell us in that chapter, does it? They're just an adversary. The cool thing is, Jesus is going to tell us more about this adversary. Okay? This sort of mysterious character in this story. Because while the people of Jerusalem were experiencing hardship under their Roman occupation, I don't think it was the Romans that they really needed deliverance from. Okay? Because Jesus is talking about an adversary that was specifically an adversary against the widows in Jerusalem. And to find out who that was, we have to look at the context of this chapter. Okay, so you see at the top there, Luke 18, verses 1 to 14, that's the parable of the persistent widow, and then there's another parable about prayer after that. Then from verse 15 on, it's an account of what happens as Jesus makes his way towards Jerusalem for his final trip to Jerusalem where he's going to die. This is close to the end of the ministry of Christ, okay? We get to chapter 19, and in chapter 19 we have the triumphal entry where Jesus rides on the colt of the donkey, and he rides into Jerusalem. It's this big deal. Everyone's excited. And then a couple of days later, he's in Jerusalem in the temple in chapter 20, and there's all these debates, okay? There's all these questions. The Pharisees and the scribes and the Herodians and all these different people keep trying to trip him up and to try to make him look bad in front of the people. Okay? Verses 1 to 4 of chapter 21, we have the account of the next widow we're going to be talking about. Then after that, it's the Olivet prophecy, okay? Then it's just a couple days later, he gets crucified. So that's where we are in the story, okay? Now, we're going to zoom forward to chapter 20, okay? So turn your Bibles to Luke chapter 20. I'm just going to pause for 1 second. I think my slides are out of order. Bear with me. I lost a slide. That's fine. Okay, Luke 20. We'll do this the old-fashioned way. Look at Luke 20, verse 45. At the end of all these debates, Jesus says, in the audience of all the people, Jesus turns from arguing with the scribes, and he turns to the people, and he says, beware of the scribes, which desire robes and love the market, highest seats in the synagogue, at feasts. And what else do? They widows' houses. And for a show, prayers. The same, he says, shall receive greater condemnation. He just says, you know what? These religious rulers, because what they do, they devour the people who are vulnerable. They use their position of authority to persecute the lives of the vulnerable, of the widows, the fatherless, the stranger. Okay? They would use their knowledge of the law to try to make it seem like they were doing that the widows were doing things wrong, and they would find a way to effectively steal their property, devouring their houses. It was the religious rulers who were the primary adversary of the widows. Interestingly, there were two things that were said there about these people. They devour widows' houses, and what was the other thing? For a pretense, they make long prayers. Okay? They're up there, they're just droning on and on and on. And we know that when they prayed, they weren't just praying like to themselves. They would go out to the most public place in the city on the street corner, and they would make these prayers publicly and loudly so everyone would see how holy they were. Okay? So now, come back with me to chapter 18 again. Chapter 18, the parable of the widow, right? It's a parable that's there to show people how they're supposed to pray, right? So they should pray so they don't lose heart. And he tells us the lesson about it. And then in verse 9, he tells another parable. Let's read the parable together, okay? He spake this parable unto them which trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. Two men went up into the temple to pray. The one was a Pharisee, and the other a publican. Okay, two people. A Pharisee, one of those religious rulers, and a publican, a tax collector, someone who was an outcast in society. Nobody liked them because they were kind of collaborators with the Romans, and they were cheats. Okay? They sinned all the time, and they hung out with prostitutes. That's what they did. Okay? Now, what's it tell us about this publican and this Pharisee? The Pharisee goes up into the temple, and he's there to pray. And what he does is he gets the highest place, and he says, all right, everybody, prayer time. Okay? He says, who's he praying to, by the way? He prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not like other men. Those people who are unjust, extortioners, adulterers, or even as this filthy publican over here. Thank you for not making me bad like them. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. I'm a good Christadelphian. I serve God the way I'm supposed to. And then he just stops his prayer because he feels pretty good after that. He's like, this is pretty good. And now everybody knows that he gives tithes, right? What a great guy, this Pharisee. Meanwhile, the publican, he stands afar off. He goes as far away as he can. Okay? He kind of hides. And he doesn't even have the courage to lift his eyes up towards heaven. And this is his prayer. God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Now, one of those men goes back to his house and is justified. One of those men receives forgiveness. One of those men is a person who God sees as righteous. It's not the person who said he was righteous, who listed the things that he did that made him righteous. It was the person who recognized that he was not. The person who recognizes his flaws, who recognizes how much of a sinner he is and how much he needs the amazing mercy of God. And that's the parable. So this is another parable about prayer. And this time it's telling us about our motivation for prayer. Why are we praying? Are we doing it to be seen of men for a pretense, so people are impressed with us? Or are we doing it because we want God to see us? We want God to look upon us with favor and to extend his grace to us. And these religious rulers were doing it to be seen of men. They were doing it for their own power and their authority. They wanted to be seen. They want people to think that they were pretty cool, that they were pretty righteous. And so these were the people who were oppressing the widows. Okay? These are the widow's adversaries. These are the people who Jesus said you have to beware of. Okay, now, come to Luke 19, okay? So we're going back on that journey towards Jerusalem now. Luke 19, interestingly enough, the first chapter of Luke 19 talks about a publican, Zacchaeus, okay, who repents, just like this one that he talked about in this parable. That's on purpose, okay? That parable is put there to prepare you for the story of Zacchaeus in chapter 19. And then, in the middle of chapter 19, Jesus rides into the city of Jerusalem triumphantly on a donkey. People say, Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Finally, our king is coming. He's going to set up the kingdom. He's going to get rid of the Romans. He's going to deal with all the problems that we've been dealing with, right? He's going to get rid of all that bad stuff. He's going to set up God's kingdom. We're going to be restored. Yay, it's great, okay? And Jesus is there. Everyone's like waving at him. Everyone is throwing their coats away down in front of him to make his path softer. They're fanning him with palm fronds, all this stuff, right? Big celebration. Jesus comes near. What does he do? He starts to cry. When he was come near, Jesus looked at the city. He wept over it, saying, If you had known, even thou, at least in this thy day, the things which belong to thy peace. But now they're hid from thine eyes. For the days will come upon thee, that thine enemies shall cast a trench about thee, and compass thee round and keep thee in on every side. He's describing a siege, right? He's saying, your enemies are going to come, they're going to besiege your city. And they will lay thee even with the ground. In other words, they're going to put all your walls and crush them into the ground. No stone is going to stand on top of another. They shall leave thee desolate in this city. Why? Because you did not know the time of your visitation. So at this point, your mind should be going, ding, ding, ding. Why? Visitation. You recall, about 30 minutes ago, we talked about how Jesus was God's visitation, right? He came to look at the people, to inspect the situation, to see who needed to be helped and who needed to be judged. Okay? And that was what Jesus did. He came to Jerusalem, he came to Israel to save people, to seek and to save. He was their Savior, he was their Redeemer, he was their Messiah. And even though at that moment, Jesus knows they're showering praises upon him, he knows in a couple of days, they're going to be screaming out for his death, and they're going to reject him. And so he cries. He says, I've tried so hard to save you, and I see you sitting there and know that you don't even realize that what I'm doing right now is doing everything I possibly can to save you, because I am the visitation of God. I'm coming to redeem you out of all your problems. But not the problems that come from the Romans. That doesn't really matter. The problems that come from your heart. The problems that come from who you are, from the sins you commit, from your unworthiness, from your stubbornness and your selfishness and your pride and the way you want to hurt people and your spitefulness. And all those things that only end in death. He's come to redeem you out of that, and they didn't recognize it. And that makes Jesus really, really sad. So then what does he do? He wipes his tears away, and he walks, or he rides into the city, and eventually hands off the donkey, I'm sure. And what does he do? This, verse 45, Luke 19. And he went into the temple, and he began to cast out them that sold therein, and them that bought, saying unto them, It is written, My house is the house of prayer, but you have made it a den of thieves. He comes into the temple and he makes a huge scene, right? He grabs a whip from someone. He chases all the cattle that was in the temple out down this long staircase, out of the wall, staircase, out of the temple. He turns over tables, which I'm not going to do to Gideon because that'd be really mean. But he makes a huge scene. And everyone's like, you're at the temple, Jesus. You're not supposed to disturb people. They're trying to worship. He's like, no, they're not. They're stealing from each other. Was what they would do is the people who were running the temple, the religious leaders, they set up an exchange market, okay, where you could only use the temple currency to buy the sacrifices that you would use to offer sacrifices, the lambs and the goats and the oxen and the pigeons and stuff. And they would do an exorbitant exchange rate, so they would steal money from all the people who came, okay? And also that whole system that was in place, the religious system, had fallen so far from what it was supposed to be, so that as we talked about a little bit earlier, these people were devouring the houses of the vulnerable. They were taking all their money. They were finding all these different ways to persecute them and to make their lives miserable. So Jesus says, this is supposed to be a house of prayer. When Solomon stood up this temple, he said, this is a place people come to pray to God. And what do? You turn it into a place where you can steal from each other, where you can hurt people, where you can abuse each other. It reminds me of 1 Corinthians 11, where Paul is writing to the Corinthians and says, there's a problem in your ecclesia, Corinthians, because when you guys come together for a memorial meeting, it's not for the better, it's for the worse. You come to the temple and it's like it's a worse place than it was at home. And that's the situation. Actually not that unusual in Israel's history, right? Because it's hard to maintain a consistent practice and love for the truth over time, isn't it? Think of the time of Hannah, right? Hannah and Samuel, in the beginning of 1 Samuel. What was happening at the tabernacle at those days? Well, the priests were sacrifices and eating it for themselves instead of giving it to God. And they were committing fornication on the doorstep of the tabernacle all the time. And they knew that was what was happening. This is what was happening at the temple. Now, the question is, what do you do when the place where you're supposed to worship is that bad? When it's full of corruption, and it's full of immorality, and it's full of terrible situations. One solution would be to say, I'm not going there anymore because it's a terrible place to be. The other solution is to say, what can I do to try to make this a little bit better? Now, what could this widow do? This widow who's being treated terribly by the religious leaders, who goes to the temple only to have her money stolen from her, right? Is she in a position to make a lot of difference? To go in there and to get after the high priest and say, look, high priest, you got to change what you're doing. Not really, right? Thrown out. So what can she do? She can bang on the door of the judge of all the earth. She can persistently pray for something to change. Not unlike Hannah, who goes to the temple. Amidst all the terrible stuff that was happening there, she kneels and she prays. She prays for God to send a redeemer, someone who would come and fix the situation. You see, the Pharisees and the scribes made the temple a den of thieves, but the widows made it a house of prayer. Because they understood the point. They remembered what Solomon said when he set up the temple. This is a place people come to pray to you, to ask for your help, where God listens. Unfortunately for Jerusalem, most people were not following the example of the widow. They were not following the example of Hannah, and trying to work within the system to change it. Instead, they allowed it to continue. And as a result, there was going to be a time of judgment coming. Jesus said, you've made this house a den of thieves, right? A house of robbers. Well, he's actually quoting from Jeremiah, okay? Jeremiah 7, verses in that section there, Jeremiah 7. He says, and Jeremiah is criticizing Jerusalem, and he says, Jerusalem, you can't claim to be the temple of Yahweh. You're sitting there saying, the temple of Yahweh, the temple of Yahweh. Hey, everybody, we're the temple of Yahweh over here, right? Just like the Pharisee who goes up and says, hey, guys, we're serving God properly. But he says, you're not. He says, because you're oppressing the fatherless and the widows. To read that section. And Jeremiah says, because you're not living up to what you're supposed to be. You're not actually acting like the temple of God. Because God's house has become a den of robbers, God is going to destroy it. Oof. Luke 21, verse 22. Okay? If you come over to, well, we can turn it if you want. I don't have time. Luke 21, 22 says, these are the days of vengeance. What's the context? The Olivet prophecy, which is about the time when the Romans were going to come and they were going to destroy Jerusalem. Why? Because the temple was no longer where people were worshiping God, praying. Instead, it was a place where corruption was happening. And if you actually look into the history of what happened when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, the worst happened was literally in the temple. Going to be torn down, and Jerusalem was going to be trampled by Gentiles because they were not living up to the principles of what God had to work. But this should not have come as a surprise to the religious leaders, because in their law that they knew so well, you guys remember what we talked about this morning? How about what God said you were supposed to do? What were you supposed to do to take care of those widows? Exodus 2, verses 21 to 22. This is like 2 chapters after the 10 Commandments. It's like the very beginning. So even if you weren't a very good, you knew this, okay? Because you're reading through it. In fact, because this is really important. Exodus chapter 22. Okay, Exodus 22, verse 21. Thou shalt not oppress a stranger, nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Verse 22. You shall not afflict a widow or a fatherless orphan. Because he says, verse 23, if thou afflict the fatherless, the widows, or the strangers in any way, and if they cry at all unto me, God says, I will surely hear their cry. If the widows cry to me, God says, I'm going to listen. So that question the widow had, will God avenge his elect? Is he listening to my prayers that I'm praying all the time? God says, way back in the law, I will listen when you oppress them. Okay? Verse 24, and my wrath will wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children shall be fatherless. So God says, listen up. If you oppress my people, especially the most vulnerable ones amongst you, I'm going to oppress you. That's what God said. So that is the dark ending of our class. Okay? So in other words, because Jerusalem had failed to live up to the spirit of the law, they had failed to remember that God wanted you to take care of the broken. And they had turned the place that was supposed to be a place where prayer happened, where people got closer to God, where people were supported and helped, and were included in a family, the broader family of God, because the whole point of being someone who follows God is that you're not bound to a physical family. Maybe you're alone. Maybe you're an orphan. Maybe you have bad relationships with those in your initial family. Maybe you had to sacrifice a lot for the truth. But you come to the truth. You come to the hope of Israel, and God says, welcome. I'm a God who puts the solitary in families. That's what I do. People who are running the gone to do that, and as a result, they were going to be judged. So what are our lessons for today? God is watching how we treat those around us. We do. And obviously, we can sit here and be happy because we don't have exorbitant exchange rates at our ecclesia. That's good. We're not doing that. And most of us don't stand up and pray in front of everybody to tell you how good I am, right? Hopefully that's not happening. But it happens in small ways, right? All of us have a temptation to try in front of people. Bend sometimes of other people's feelings and their positions, right? All of us have passed by so many opportunities to help someone who needed help, right? Someone who maybe was less popular or who was kind of awkward, out of help, but we didn't know them very well, and so we just leave them to themselves and we hope that they'll be okay and maybe someone else can help them, right? But God says, I'm watching what you're doing. I'm watching how you're caring for each other. It matters. And related to that, don't make God's house a place that you go for your personal profit. Obviously, we come to the ecclesia, we come to a weekend like this, we get a lot out of it. Good. Right? But we shouldn't be going there just so we can feel good about ourselves, so we can enrich ourselves. It's not somewhere we go just to make our guilty conscience feel better and give us a false sense of self-worth. It makes us bad things we do during the week. That's what the house is for. Covet ecclesia. There's no place. Our mission for all of us, okay, here, today, tomorrow, next week, CYC, Sunday school, meeting, Bible class, make God's house a place of persistent prayer.